Welcome back, everyone. We're about to take a deep dive into, well, some pretty interesting historical predictions.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, we're going back to 1974, during the Cold War, right after the whole Vietnam thing.
Okay, setting the scene.
Exactly. And we've got this declassified CIA document.
Ooh, juicy.
It is. It tried to pinpoint, like, all the world's future hotspots, those potential crisis areas everyone's always talking about.
So kind of like a geopolitical crystal ball.
Exactly. And what's so cool is this document, it actually lists all these potential crisis areas. It's like a time capsule of all the geopolitical anxieties of the time.
A time capsule. I like that.
It was released from the CIA's Crest archive back in '98.
Okay.
But it's like a snapshot of that moment, the world on edge trying to figure out what's next.
Makes sense. I mean, the 70s were a pretty wild time, globally speaking.
Oh, absolutely. And you might be surprised by some of the areas on this list. Some are still making headlines today.
Oh, really?
And others, thankfully, never blew up the way the CIA thought they would.
All right, so where do we even start with this?
Well, this document covers a lot, but let's start with Asia. Back in '74, the CIA labeled the entire region a potential powder keg.
A powder keg. Wow.
Yeah, they basically thought it was super volatile, could erupt at any moment.
Given what was happening in Vietnam at the time, I can see why they'd be on edge.
Right. And on top of that, the document, it lists a whole bunch of specific flashpoints that they were worried about.
Like what?
Well, there's the Sino-Soviet border, the border between China and the Soviet Union.
Right, for those who might not remember that term.
Exactly. They also flagged the Korean Peninsula, the South China Sea, the Yellow Sea.
It sounds like they were worried about pretty much every body of water in the region.
Pretty much. And the borders, too, the Sino-Indian border, the Indo-Pakistani border. It goes on and on.
Wow. So they weren't exactly optimistic about Asia's future.
Not exactly. They even mentioned the Taiwan Straits, the Indian Ocean, and these disputed islands between Japan and Russia they called the Northern Islands issue.
Okay, so they were really looking at every nook and cranny.
Oh, yeah, they even mentioned internal insurgencies in Thailand, Malaysia, the Philippines, Cambodia, and Vietnam.
So basically they thought all of Asia was about to explode.
Right. But were they just being paranoid, or were these legitimate concerns?
Well, some of their predictions were incredibly accurate. Look at the South China Sea, for example.
Oh, yeah, that's still a hot topic.
Exactly. Even back then, the CIA flagged territorial disputes and competition over natural resources as potential triggers for conflict.
And here we are, decades later, still dealing with the same issues.
It just goes to show you some geopolitical issues, they stick around.
They really do. So they nailed that one. What about some of these other hotspots they mentioned? Did any of those actually pan out?
Well, that Sino-Soviet border was a big one. They saw it as a potential flashpoint between these two communist giants who weren't exactly getting along.
Kind of like if the U.S. and Canada suddenly became rivals, but with, way more nukes involved?
That's a good analogy. Thankfully, it never escalated to a full-blown war.
Oh, thank goodness.
Yeah, there were some border clashes, a lot of posturing, but nothing too crazy. But it was a valid concern at the time.
It's crazy to think how much the world has changed since then, right? The Soviet Union's gone. China's this global superpower. It's a different planet almost.
It really shows you just how unpredictable geopolitics can be.
True, true. But what about those internal insurgencies they mentioned in Southeast Asia? Were they right to be worried about those?
They were onto something. You've got to remember, the Vietnam War had a hugely destabilizing effect on the region.
Right. It left behind a lot of mess to clean up.
Exactly. Power vacuums, simmering resentments, all ripe for exploitation.
So the CIA was right to be concerned about the ripple effects of the war.
Definitely. Conflicts don't just end when the fighting stops. The aftershocks, they can be felt for years, even decades.
That's a good point. Okay, so we've seen some of the potential crisis areas in Asia that the CIA identified back in '74.
Right. Some hits, some misses, but overall, I'd say they had a pretty good grasp of the big picture.
Okay, yeah. What about the Middle East? I'm guessing that was also on their radar?
Oh, absolutely. And that's where their list is really interesting.
Oh.
Yeah, they basically hit every major issue that's still plaguing the Middle East even today.
No way.
Yeah, buckle up because we're about to go deep on this one. We're talking the Arab-Israeli conflict, tensions between Greece and Turkey.
Including the Cyprus issue.
Yep, that too, and the Iraq-Iran rivalry. Oh, and we can't forget the Kurdish problem.
Yeah, that's been going on for, seems like forever.
And then there's Pakistan and Afghanistan, always a tense relationship there.
So basically, the CIA just took all the long-standing conflicts and said, yep, those are going to be problems.
Pretty much. And they didn't stop there. They also flagged the whole oil-producing area as a potential crisis zone.
Makes sense. I mean, this was right after the '73 oil crisis.
Exactly. That crisis really showed everyone how important oil was strategically.
And, it seems like oil is still causing all sorts of problems.
It's a recurring theme, that's for sure. Competition over vital resources, it's a major driver of instability.
Okay, so they were right about oil. What about the other Middle Eastern issues? Any other prophetic insights there?
Well, their take on the Arab-Israeli conflict was pretty spot on. They knew it was a persistent source of instability.
And sadly, it still is today.
Yeah. although the players and dynamics have shifted over the years.
It's kind of sad how little progress has been made there, even with all the diplomacy and peace efforts.
It is, but going back to the list, they even mentioned potential issues in Romania and Yugoslavia.
Romania and Yugoslavia, that seems so random now.
Right. Specifically, they were worried about Tito's succession and the Trieste dispute.
The Trieste dispute between Italy and Yugoslavia, right?
You got it. They even had Spain, Portugal, and Ireland on their list.
Wow, they really did cover all the bases. So which of those Middle Eastern predictions do you think were the most, I don't know, prescient?
Besides the Arab-Israeli conflict and the whole oil situation, I'd say their understanding of the Kurdish issue really stands out. It's this complex problem that's been simmering for decades, a struggle for self-determination across multiple countries.
Yeah, and still a major issue today.
It's amazing how these problems can last for generations.
It really is. Okay, so the Middle East was definitely a big concern for the CIA. What about Latin America? Were they watching that part of the world too?
Oh, yeah, and you can see the Cold War's influence all over their analysis.
How so?
Well, their list for Latin America included Peru, Chile, possibly Bolivia, Cuba, Panama, and Argentina. They were really worried about Cuba.
Well, yeah, Cuba being a Soviet ally right there in America's backyard.
Right, they were worried about Cuba's influence and the potential for them to, stir up trouble, saw it as a key piece in the Cold War chessboard.
Did anything major happen in Cuba during that time?
Some internal tensions and economic challenges, but no major crises erupted there.
Okay.
However, their concerns about instability in Chile, those turned out to be tragically accurate.
Right, the military coup in '73, led by Pinochet?
Exactly. A violent overthrow of a democratically elected government leading to years of repression and human rights abuses. The CIA, they had Chile pegged as a vulnerable spot, but they couldn't have predicted those specific events.
That's a tough lesson. Even with all the intel in the world, you can't foresee every twist and turn.
You can't, and it's important to remember that as we look back at these predictions. It's easy to judge with hindsight, but they were working with limited information in a very different context.
That's true. So they were right about Chile, not so much about Cuba. What about the rest of Latin America? Any other concerns that panned out?
They flagged issues in Peru, Bolivia, Panama, and Argentina. Some materialized, some didn't. Like Peru experienced some instability and economic turmoil.
Not a full-blown crisis, though.
Not quite like the CIA might have imagined. And then Argentina, they predicted a crisis there, and it just didn't really happen.
Another swing and a miss. So Latin America was a mixed bag for the CIA?
Yep, some accurate predictions, some way off. But what about Africa? That continent must have been a completely different story in the 1970s.
Oh, yeah. Africa was in the midst of huge change. Right after colonialism, new countries popping up, old power structures crumbling. Must have been a ton of uncertainty.
Absolutely. And to the CIA's credit, their list for Africa was way shorter than for other regions. They focused on the Horn of Africa, Ethiopia and Somalia, and then Southern Africa, Angola, and Mozambique.
So more selective with their predictions there. Do you think that was because they knew how complex the situation was?
It's hard to say for sure, but it's likely they recognized how tough it was to make accurate forecasts in such a rapidly changing environment.
Okay, with that enough. What about the specific predictions they did make in Africa? How did those turn out?
Well, in the Horn of Africa, they were right about the potential for conflict between Ethiopia and Somalia.
Those two haven't exactly been best buds, have they?
Not really. They had this long-standing border dispute, competing claims over the Ogaden region.
An area with a lot of Somalis, but part of Ethiopia, right?
Yep. And in 1977, a full-blown war broke out between them over their Ogaden.
Wow, so the CIA was right on the money with that prediction.
They were, but Angola and Mozambique, those were tough ones. Both countries had civil wars going on after independence.
Which the CIA predicted, right?
They did flag them as potential crisis zones, but figuring out how those conflicts would actually play out, that was almost impossible.
I can imagine. So many factors, internal and external, pulling in different directions. Must have been like untangling a giant knot.
Exactly. So many factions, ideologies, interests, all fighting for power. And then you had the Cold War superpowers messing around, backing different sides.
Adding fuel to the fire.
Exactly. It just goes to show that sometimes, even with all the intel and analysis in the world, it's just impossible to predict exactly how things will go down. Too many variables, too many unpredictable factors.
Geopolitics is complicated.
It's a messy business, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try to understand it. Even if we can't perfectly predict the future, we can learn from the past, identify potential risks.
So we can make better decisions.
That's the goal. Okay, so we've looked at Asia, the Middle East, Latin America, and Africa.
The CIA was busy trying to figure out all the potential trouble spots.
They were, and their track record, not perfect, but they did identify some key trends and flashpoints that are still shaping the world today.
Like they were spot on about the South China Sea, the Arab-Israeli conflict, and the instability in Chile.
Absolutely. And the interesting thing is many of the underlying causes of those conflicts, like resource competition, political instability, ethnic tensions, those are still relevant today.
The same old problems, just playing out in different ways.
Exactly. It's like the recurring themes of geopolitics repeating across different regions and time periods makes you wonder what lessons we can take from the CIA's 1974 predictions, something that can help us understand the world today.
Yeah, are there any tools or approaches we could use to, I don't know, try to get ahead of the curve when it comes to spotting those potential crisis areas?
That's a fantastic question, and I think this document gives us some valuable insights to help us navigate today's world.
All right, so we've seen how the CIA, back in '74, they tried to map out the world's future, right?
Yeah, some pretty impressive hits, like you said.
South China Sea, the Arab-Israeli conflict, even the instability in Chile.
They were definitely paying attention. But even with that,
Yeah,
geopolitics is messy, right? Even the experts.
they can't predict everything.
Exactly. And that's where things get even more interesting because
Okay.
while they were zeroing in on these hotspots, some massive changes were happening, stuff the CIA didn't fully anticipate.
Oh, so like what did they miss? What were the big surprises that reshaped the world?
Okay, well, one of the biggest, the collapse of the Soviet Union. Remember this fork?
Middle of the Cold War.
Right. The Soviet Union was the superpower, locked in this ideological battle with the U.S.
It felt like that rivalry would last forever.
Exactly. And while the CIA noted some tensions within the Soviet bloc, they didn't see the rapid implosion coming.
So a superpower just vanished. How could they not see that coming?
Hindsight is 20/20, right? But at the time, the Soviet system, it looked stable, at least on the surface.
I guess so. But there had to be signs, right?
There were cracks, for sure. But most analysts, they expected a gradual decline, not a total collapse.
So what did they miss? Or were they blinded by like their Cold War assumptions?
Probably a bit of both. They underestimated the economic problems in the Soviet Union and the growing discontent among people, and
What about Gorbachev?
Gorbachev's reforms, ironically, probably accelerated the collapse. He was trying to fix things, but
It backfired.
in a way, yeah, it's like even rock-solid empires, they can crumble when the pressure gets too much.
It's a good reminder to never get too comfy, I guess.
Exactly. Don't get too caught up in assumptions. You got to question your biases. Look for things that challenge your worldview.
Okay, so the fall of the Soviet Union, that was a major curveball. What other surprises were there in the '70s?
The rise of China. Now, the CIA document, it did recognize China's potential,
But
but they didn't quite grasp the speed or the scale of its economic transformation.
back then, China was still recovering from the Cultural Revolution.
Exactly. They were isolated, nowhere near the economic powerhouse they are today. I think the CIA underestimated the impact of Deng Xiaoping's reforms.
The ones that opened up China?
Yep, they unleashed China's economic potential.
And now they're a major force, challenging the U.S. It's crazy how quickly things changed.
It is, and it tells us we need to keep updating our understanding of the world.
Because what seems minor today could be huge tomorrow.
Exactly. Okay, so we've got the collapse of the Soviet Union, the rise of China, things the CIA didn't fully see coming. Anything else?
Don't keep me in suspense.
Globalization. They noted the growing interdependence of nations, but they didn't grasp how tech, trade, communication,
To shrink the world.
yeah, create new opportunities and new challenges.
Globalization was still pretty new back then, wasn't it?
Early stages. The internet wasn't a big thing yet. They couldn't have predicted the scale of global trade, the rise of, multinational corporations, the speed of information.
Globalization was a total game changer.
Completely. It reshaped everything, created new avenues for cooperation, but also for conflict.
Cyber warfare, economic competition.
The rapid spread of ideas and ideologies, yeah.
Makes you wonder what else is out there that we can't even imagine yet.
That's the thing about the world. It's always evolving, defying our expectations.
So if even the CIA, with all its intel, all its experts, could miss these huge changes,
Right.
what hope do the rest of us have? How can we even begin to make sense of such a complicated world?
That is the million-dollar question. I think the key is you got to cultivate a mindset of continuous learning.
Always be learning.
Yeah, be hungry for information, but also be critical. Question what, look for signs that challenge your assumptions.
So it's not just about having the answers, it's about asking the right questions.
Exactly. And being ready to change course when you learn something new. The world's too complex to be stuck in your old ways of thinking.
Well, that's a great takeaway. This whole deep dive into the CIA's 1974 predictions, it's been quite a journey. We saw what they got right, what they missed,
and how much the world can change in ways no one saw coming.
Yeah. It reminds us that we're all just trying to figure things out as we go.
It's been a pleasure exploring all this with you. And for everyone listening, check out the source document. Okay, the link's in the show notes. It's really fascinating, a glimpse into a pivotal moment in history.
And it shows us the future, always full of surprises.
Always.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.